welcome to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omar. Now, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons represents 193 states around the world. Its main goal is working for a world free of chemical weapons. As the implementing body for the Chemical Weapons Convention, which protects 98% of the world population, the OPCW has done extensive work in documenting and proving use of chemical weapons in conflict zones and destroying their stockpiles. In 2013, the OPCW was even awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for its extensive efforts to eliminate chemical weapons. But for the past week, a leaked document authored by one of its own has questioned the credibility of this very organization. Until last week, the organization's reports on a chemical attack in Douma, Syria in April 2018 that killed at least 35 civilians officially maintained that the 2 gas cylinders carrying chlorine gas were dropped from the air, possibly by the Syrian regime helicopter. The missing 15-page dissenting assessment that was omitted from public view by the OPCW states otherwise, that it is more likely that the probability that the cylinders were manually placed there instead is higher. Let's take a look at what this 15-page document essentially said that was leaked and now is causing a big uproar about the veracity and the credibility of the OPCW.
On the 7th of April 2018, a chemical weapon attack took place in Douma, a southwestern city in Syria. Some 35 to 70 civilians were killed. 7 days later, the US, France and the UK attacked Syria with cruise missiles. The Syrian government denied involvement in the Douma attacks and called the airstrikes a violation of international law. A fact-finding mission deputed by the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons published its report almost a year later, stating it found reasonable grounds for believing a toxic chemical had been used as a weapon in Douma and suggested that the chemical was delivered by 2 gas cylinders dropped from the air. Since the rebels did not have air support then, the Syrian regime were blamed. What it did not mention was the dissenting assessment by one of the fact-finding mission members, Ian Henderson. Henderson, in his report, said observations at the scene of the 2 locations, together with subsequent analysis, suggest that there is a higher probability that both cylinders were manually placed at those 2 locations rather than being delivered from the aircraft. Henderson's document, now leaked to the public, begs the question why the OPCW did not mention there was a conflicting point of view.
I'd like to hear our guest, Mr. Piers Robinson, a researcher at the WGSPM in Berlin, and also Professor Emeritus Boyd Barrett from California, joining us here on Newswire. Welcome to the show. Mr. Piers, I want to start with you. You have spoken quite openly during your tenure at the University of Sheffield, I believe, about this media propaganda. And you are part of a group, the WGSPM, that is the working group of Syria propaganda, and have highlighted how there have been discrepancies on this. What do you make now of this report, the leaked document of this report surfacing now?
Well, we've been exploring, or a number of us have been exploring, the question of Syria and the role of propaganda and information operations. And we have been paying very close attention to the question of the alleged chemical weapons attacks. The document which we published, which was leaked to us, was a document which we were initially surprised to see, but we had been aware over the year, especially with the interim OPCW report, that there were some very obvious, very serious problems with the way the OPCW had been conducting its research. And we had already published briefing notes making this point, also about earlier OPCW investigations into alleged chemical weapons attacks. And it was becoming very apparent to us that the weaknesses in some of the reports the OPCW was putting out might well lead to a situation where there was unease within the OPCW, where the scientists and engineers who are trying to do a good job might be very concerned that their reputations might be coming into question. And so I think this leaked document emerges out of unease within the OPCW. It's obviously extremely important now because the final report on Douma had a number of problems, and really in many ways the leaked engineering report seems to confirm many of the issues and concerns that non-experts and experts had raised about the final OPCW report. So I think this is now a very critical moment for the OPCW to really address and to become more transparent, but critically to address exactly what has been going on within the organisation when it comes to these very contentious, very controversial alleged events in Syria.
The fact that they hid it is the biggest issue here right now. It goes really against their favor. Professor Boyd, what do you think is the reason behind them hiding this 15-page report, which was written by one of their own, Ian Henderson? And it even said it was a handwritten note on the report that said final draft, and it was supposed to go in just a few days before the final report was published, but it was not acknowledged at all. What do you think was the reason behind that?
We can't at this moment be absolutely certain as to the reason, but of course we should be concerned about the activities and the processes and the protocols of all of these regulatory agencies, the OPCW, similar to the International Atomic Energy Association, similar to some of these international inquiries that have been set up to investigate issues such as the downing of MH17 in eastern Ukraine. There's a tendency for the general public and for the mainstream media to presume that these agencies are always above suspicion. And I think in the light of what we have just seen with the OPCW this last week, but also on previous occasions, increasingly, the wisdom, the possibility of this presumption is coming under question. And this is of unparalleled importance, I think, in our understanding of the machinations that go on in establishing pretexts for war or for international aggression.
So, right, Mr. Piers, what is your take on what observers are saying, that this is actually, from this document, confirms that this was a staged event, that that rebels were actually the ones behind placing these cylinders?
Well, it's a question at this point of the weight of evidence. Now, there are engineers who can assess the claims being made in the Henderson report, and there are engineers who can assess what the OPCW put into their final report, who are better qualified than I am to discuss the question of the cylinders and how they got to where they are. What should obviously be done now is that all of the assessments commissioned by the OPCW should be published and should be available for public and expert scrutiny so that we can have a proper scientific evaluation of Henderson's analysis and the analysis which the OPCW seems to have ended up relying upon in its final report. But beyond that, and this point about the kind of weight of evidence that we have now, we have question marks over the cylinders and the idea that they may well have been placed there. We also, in terms of the OPCW's final report, major inconsistencies. The consistencies attribute the deaths of the people in the building at location 2 to chlorine, or chlorine is the substance which is identified as the likely cause of death. However, the report itself admits that the placing of the bodies, the people seem to have fallen dead on the spot, is not consistent with chlorine, okay? So you have a stark question being raised about how did these people actually get killed in the first place if it's not chlorine, if the arrangement of the bodies doesn't suggest that they were killed by chlorine and something else, and yet the OPCW only found chlorine. You know, you have an issue of a war crime and a murder investigation. We also, in addition to this, we have Riyam Delati from the BBC stated very clearly 2 months ago that the hospital scenes had been staged, which were shown around the world from the Douma incident. So we have three things. We have a major question mark over the cause of deaths. We have people such as Riyam Delati from the BBC claiming that the hospital scenes were staged, as well as obviously the Russians. And now we have the question over the cylinders. And I think when you add all of those things together, I think we're looking at a weight of evidence now pointing very clearly in the direction of some kind of staged event having occurred at Douma.
Right. So, Professor Boyd, does this surprise you, the surfacing of this leaked document? Does this surprise you at all? That really does put in question the actual intentions that NATO had in attacking Syria?
Yes, I mean, to some extent it surprises and alarms me. For a long time now, we've had good reason to be concerned about the OPCW and its reports. Although even more disturbing than the OPCW is the fact that Western nations, led by the United States, and in conjunction with some of its allies, including, for example, in the case of Duma, France, have launched missile attacks against a foreign country, namely, in this instance, Syria, long before any credible evidence had been ascertained, had been amassed. So the question arises then, well, if they're prepared to take action long before the evidence is actually there, do they really care as to the quality of the evidence when it surfaces? And I suppose, in as much as there's any surprise here, it is, well, perhaps they care enough to bring pressure to bear to try to ensure that the evidence, when it is eventually published, appears or is fabricated to appear to support the action that was taken long before the evidence could possibly have been accumulated in the first instance.
And it also puts in question all the previous reports have come out of the OPCW. Mr. Piers, is there any kind of precedence that has been set in terms of observers thinking that this is actually staged and it was staged by the rebels?
Well, it is interesting. If you go back and look at some of the earlier OPCW investigations of alleged attacks in Syria, I mean, they're very heavily reliant upon opposition sources, okay, who obviously have an incentive and an interest in lying. But even in some of the details of the earlier FFM reports, there's certainly one example where they talk about discounting some evidence which had been supplied to them, some video footage, because it implies very strongly that it had in fact been manipulated or staged. So even in the details of earlier OPCW reports, you can see these indications of possible staging. And I think in terms of the broader understanding of Syria, this is a major, huge war which has been running for 7 years with huge resources put into it and many, many countries involved trying to overthrow the Syrian government. I mean, obviously, Russia and Iran supporting the Syrian government. And in that kind of conflict, you do have major propaganda operations being set up and operated. And I think that's the thing that we need to look at very carefully. In the case of Iraq, we had a WMD propaganda narrative promoted by Western governments. And I think the question, the working hypothesis now is, have we had a sort of WMD 2.0 in the case of Syria, where there's actually been some kind of staging of chemical attacks and so on in order to delegitimate the regime, or the Syrian government rather, and in order to sort of shore up French, US, UK, Qatari action against the Syrian government. I think that's what we're looking at now. We're looking at the possibility of a very big propaganda campaign, not dissimilar to what we saw in the case of Iraq, except in this case, they're not just claiming WMD, they're going out and as it were, instigating events which can be attributed.
Okay, so Professor Boy, quickly ask you this last question here. We have seen that the OPCW has come out and given statements that they'll investigate how this document got leaked in the first place and who's responsible for it. What do you make of this response, considering what is not said at all is whether there is any weightage in this report from their own people?
The response from the OPCW, in my view, has been exceptionally clumsy. I don't think they were expecting that this technical assessment by Henderson was going to be published. It seems obvious to me that they were taken aback. They were taken aback when it was leaked. Their responses have been utterly contradictory and I think illogical. So this is to be welcomed, that there is at last some kind of crack in the edifice of competence and certainty that these organizations generally strive to present to the outside world. So I think in support of Professor Robinson's point of view, I think, yes, what is required here is far greater transparency, far greater humility on the part of all parties, as to the methodologies and the strengths and weaknesses of the particular methodologies that are employed.
All right, Professor Boyd, thank you so much. Sorry to cut you there for your input. And coming back to you, Mr. Piers, we're talking about the evidence also of gas attacks. Now, those are notoriously difficult to ascertain. It's not an exact science. Is that true?
Well, in a sense, nothing is an exact science. Okay, there are always questions which can be raised and so on. But obviously, the OPCW and the FFN teams are set up in order to gather evidence and to try to establish. And I think it is perfectly possible to gather evidence and to do it in an objective way, which does allow you to make draw reasonable conclusions about what is likely to have happened. You can do that. We do that all the time. Legal processes, etc. This is all about looking at evidence and assessing evidence, and you can do that in the case of these kinds of attacks. The problem at the moment, it seems that some of the evidence was let through, as it were, in the final OPCW report, and some of the other evidence wasn't allowed through, which, again, as Oliver has just pointed out, this raises a big question about the impartiality of the OPCW. And if we're serious about dealing with chemical weapons, and if the OPCW wants to be serious about dealing with this, we need to make sure that it's reliable, that it makes the correct judgments, and we also need to make sure that these kinds of institutions are not vulnerable and are not manipulated by major states. And obviously the question mark in this case is whether France, Britain and America have manipulated that process of assessing the evidence for their own political interests. So the problem is not that this can't be done, that we can't establish the truth. It's a question of trying to make sure that political actors who have a motivation to pressurize these organizations are not allowed to get away with it.
Right. Thank you so much, Mr. Piers Robinson there with your input. And we are now joined by Mr. Hadi Nasrallah. He's an activist. He's joining us from London. Hadi, I understand you were able to visit Doma a few days after the attack. Could you tell us what you came across after this chemical weapon attack took place there in April 2018?
Basically, I'll start by saying that the OPCW report was not, it was too weak for them to actually have any proof of use of chemical attacks. They did not give any good sources of any sarin that was used in the crime scene or alleged crime scene. When I went there, it was actually 20 days after the attack, and I was talking to the people being evacuated from Duma by the Syrian army after the deal that happened between Russia and the militants. Most people, I was surprised that most people who were being evacuated from Duma were supposed to be involved in what was supposed to be happening with the chemical attack. They were actually telling me that they had no idea what I was talking about. They didn't know anything about a chemical attack or a chemical scenario happening in the area. A young man approached me, and he said that we do not know anything about a chemical attack, but we know that when there was an attack in the area, we were told by the white helmets that we were supposed to be choking, and there was some sort of chemicals being inhaled by the victim. So we just panicked and started screaming, and the white helmets were just taking videos and pouring water on videos. And they did not just tell me that, they told a lot of foreign journalists, who some only decided to report this to the news.
So that's an interesting point you raised there. Internationally, even now, the media hasn't really picked up on this leaked document, which is a pretty big statement coming from an organization that's supposed to be protecting the world from chemical weapons. What do you make of that?
The surprising part for me is not the media, to be honest. It's the OPCW that's still shying away from questions from journalists and news outlets who want to know more and highlight the fact that there are more documents on another side of the story that the OPCW refused to share with us. The OPCW tried to actually give some insights on what's happening by saying they're going to investigate who leaked the report. But what the world wants to know right now is not who leaked the report, is why the fact did you hide another side of the story that can be essential to Syria and the peace process in Syria.
Well, there's one argument there that it was one dissenting voice that might be a disgruntled OPCW employee investigator who felt like he wasn't being heard. Don't you think that has a valid sort of standing to explain why this was not covered by the OPCW or made public?
I don't think it's that situation, because for me, the OPCW, when they issued their official report, it was, for them, it was already too weak. They couldn't add any more stuff where they cannot justify any condemnation against the Syrian government.
So how do you tell me this? When you went there in 2018 to visit the site, you mentioned you went there 20 days later, and then you went and spoke to people in the area around the building where this incident took place. Those 20 days, do you think that maybe would have been a bit too late to actually get the information of how it happened or what happened?
20 days, I went there. I went to some liberated area surrounding Ghouta, which was the only time we can actually go inside. But we did go earlier to surrounding areas, and we spoke to a lot of civilians who should know if there was an attack happening that night. And they said they couldn't recall any attack, but they said that it was too close. If there's a chemical attack, they would have been harmed also by it. But we went later inside, and we saw the holes in the ceilings where the cylinders allegedly fell. And I looked at them, they're exactly the same as the mortar shellings that were happening in Damascus by the Islamists in Ghouta. And I found it very weird because they would not, it couldn't manage to fit inside it.
Right. Okay. Thank you so much, Hadi, for your input there of what you saw when you went to Duma in 2018. We're also joined by Maram Susli, an activist joining us from Perth. Welcome to Newswire again, Maram. We're talking about how the media has not really picked up on this massive story. OPCW essentially has been shying away from questions from reporters and journalists. And besides that, the media centers around the world don't seem to be very keen on talking about whether there is a big question mark on who was behind the chemical weapon attack in Syria in 2018.
Well, the media, which, it has this facade of being neutral, is actually very much controlled by the governments which run it, or people like Rupert Murdoch, who actually have a business deal with Israel to drill oil out of the Golan Heights. So they have a strong interest, this media, in trying to tarnish the reputation of the Syrian government and create a pretext like they did with the Iraq war, this WMD story, chemical weapons, this idea that Syria used chemical weapons and also did not get rid of its chemical weapons the same way that they did with Iraq. So it's just the same narrative being pushed over and over and again. And it seems that the OPCW has become politicized.
Let me welcome the guest here. Mr. Fadel Abdul Ghany is a human rights activist joining us from Doha. Mr. Fadel, let me ask you this. Do you think now that this document has been revealed, that it also impacts the statement coming from the State Department that there might be the use of chemical weapons right now by the Syrian regime in Idlib?
First of all, I don't think that anyone who is following the Syria file is doubt about the use of chemical weapons by the regime. The Commission of Inquiry has improved 34 attacks committed by the Syrian regime. This Commission of Inquiry established by Human Rights Council. Those are the UN investigators. This is the first one. The second point is the GIM, the mechanism, which is established by the UN Security Council resolution, which is agreed by the Russian. It's very strange that anyone also doubt this mechanism. The resolution is 2235, is established in August 2015. This mechanism actually committed by the UN and the OPCW in order to determine who is the side is committed the chemical weapons, issued 5 reports, and accused the regime 3 times by using chemical weapons and ISIS 2 times. Then the Russian veto is destroy this mechanism so that the OPCW take further step and by
they did veto, but there have been 336 chemical weapon attacks in Syria since 2012, and this is quoting the Global Public Policy Institute in Berlin. You're saying out of these, 35 have been concluded to be attributed to the Syrian regime. Hence, it is by default every chance that they're responsible for the attack in Douma?
Yes, of course. We are in Syrian Network for Human Rights, documented 221 chemical attacks based on our database, where is the location, testimonies, lots of evidence.
But those are 35 attacks that have been confirmed, you're saying, by various organizations investigating them. What of the 301 chemical weapon attacks that have taken place in Syria? Who is responsible for those?
Those are ISIS only responsible for 4th attack, all the remaining responsible by Assad regime. There is no even single attack by other side like BYD or opposition or al-Nusra.
So if that was the case, wouldn't there be even more? 336 is a huge number. Wouldn't there be even more irrefutable evidence out there? And OPCW right now wouldn't be under fire for having tried to conceal a legal document that essentially said that the probability of these cylinders being placed is much higher. It's not just about the placement of the cylinders. There's also in question that 35 people were killed, and it was not explained how they might have died connected to these placement of these allegedly chlorine cylinders.
Yes, but the Commission of Inquiry almost accused the regime by committed Douma attack. Human Rights Watch as well, Amnesty International. We are at Syrian Network for Human Rights. So several also sides accuse the regime. This Latakia attack, which happened past week, we issued a report confirming that Assad regime is the one who is again using the chemical weapons. Now, what is needed actually? Need also further step toward punish this regime who keep repeatedly use the chemical weapons. Then by his propaganda arm, the Russian propaganda arm, the Iranian one, trying to actually make propaganda that, okay, see, this is, we are not the one, this is the other one, and also decline all the UN reports, all the research report by Human Rights Watch, by the expert actually, and try to use this propaganda. When if we go to the expert, if we go to the GEM and the Commission of Inquiry, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, those are very reliable source. We'll never find
it still puts in. Sorry, I'm going to cut you here, Mr. Fadel. Running out of time. We just got the last 2 minutes left here. Maram, I just want your input on, as you heard our guests talking about various organizations, impartial organizations that are supposed to be investigating, and their results to be taken as the strongest sort of evidence against crimes. It really puts into question then, is it just that we are going to be looking at, with this leaked document, we are doubting these organizations and we can only rely on Julian Assange type characters or Chelsea Manning type people who leak information for our benefit? I mean, where do we turn to for reliable information then?
Where do we get the idea that these organizations are neutral? Amnesty International, they have members of the State Department working there. Their propaganda caused many hundreds of Africans to be killed in Libya, Black Africans, because they said that they were being used as mercenaries. The Human Rights Watch is run by Ken Roth, who is known to be very sympathetic to Israel and never accuses Israel really of the crimes that it commits. He's very soft on Israel. So these organizations, they're basically the mouthpieces of the United States. The first chemical attack that happened in Syria was in Aleppo, not Damascus, and it was an attack on a government-held area where Syrian soldiers were killed. And actually, that wasn't the first time. There was a second time more recently, and nobody seems to talk about that. This is something that we never even hear about anymore. And it's just so convenient, isn't it, that somehow ISIS has chemical weapons, but Al-Qaeda doesn't. Who does it benefit? These stories that are coming out. Of course, there is a doubt. The gentleman is trying to say there is no doubt. There's absolutely a doubt. And it's a lie to say the OPCW accused any party, because it's outside of the OPCW's mandate to accuse any party. So the thing is here, who benefits? They told us that Syria has this extensive sarin program with very, very technological missiles that are biphasic, which means that the two chemicals are mixed after the missile is released. And then suddenly we have this gas cylinder on a bed, and this is somehow supposed to be the same kind of thing. I think what we're seeing here is Iraq. Number two, they fed us lies about WMDs then, and now they're doing the same thing. And it seems like people have a goldfish memory and they just can't remember.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Ms. Maram. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. And also, Mr. Fadel, for your input there. We will be taking a quick short break. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You're watching Newswire. Now, analysts are saying today nationalism is on the rise. Nationalist parties have won in various countries across the world. Italy, Hungary, Brazil, and United States are some examples in recent past. Now, President Trump won largely through nationalist politics and rhetoric. We all know that. Nearly 1/3 of the seats in the European Parliament, also we've seen that concluded, were nationalist parties. We will be discussing with our guest today if this is prevalent across the world, and if so, what is the threat that it poses to globalization, to trade, to cultural integration and tolerance? I'd like to introduce here our guests who are joining us. We have with us Mr. Nishant Varma, an analyst joining us from Mumbai, and also we have Mr. Resul Sardar, an analyst joining us from Istanbul. Welcome to Newswire. I want to start with you, Mr. Nishant, especially in context of the elections that have just taken place in India. Once again, the masses have voted for a nationalist party. Do you feel like this is a trend that is picking up across the world and India is no exception?
Well, thank you for having me on the program. I must say that right from Leo Tolstoy to late the great Rabindranath Tagore, everyone has described nationalism or patriotism to be rather an evil or a measles for the mankind. Having said that, yes, we understand that nationalism is on rise because I suppose democracy, anarchy, monarchy, all have seen one or the other way the path to success. But now what was probably left behind is the differentiation of egotism versus nationalism. So egotism was something which was played through monarchs and anarchs. But now what is happening is that we find nationalism or patriotism taking over egotism. And that's probably the only way newer parties or newer rulers who have now come in and joined the bandwagon across the globe have been able to successfully inject so as to gain power. So yes, it is not good for the health of this world. However, this probably is the success mantra which has been followed and taken up by various rulers as currently serving.
Right. Now, Mr. Resul, also in Israel, similarly, the elections were won by nationalists and the religious right. Do you feel that democracy, in the name of democracy, in the name of globalizations, there is becoming this trend now where minorities are the ones who are going to suffer the most as a result?
Well, for the Israeli case, I think it's a particular, a specific case. So Israel will not be a good example in terms of the rise of the nationalism, because in any way, Israel has been founded as a nation state, or a nation state that's based on a certain race. That is in the nature of the state of Israel, being that much of the nationalist or far right. Even the leftist government in Israel that has been funding the governments before, to a certain extent, they have been kind of rightist leftist by their policies that they have conducted. So in Israel, the environment, psychological environment, that has been promoted by the policymakers and or by the state authorities have always been simply that we are surrounded by the ocean of the enemies, and so we have to be patriotic, we have to be nationalist. And so Israel first has always been the top policy of the Israeli politicians since decades. So in that sense, I would say, well, Israel actually is not a good example in terms of the global nationalism, because it has always been, to a certain extent, a nationalist
But the
country.
question of identity, Resul, that you seem to be highlighting here with Israel is also which is seen common and prevalent across all of those countries that are proposing and pushing the nationalist agenda. Is that not the case?
That's true. For the Israeli case, I think mostly it is because of the recent attitude that has been adopted by the administration in Washington. So far, none of the American governments have been so much publicly supporting almost every action of Israel. And of course, this American administration, to a certain extent, more or less, have always been supportive to the state of Israel, but none of them has been that much publicly supportive as much as Trump's administration. Mm-hmm. So since Trump's administration is that much recklessly and without any question and without regarding any international rules or the law, supporting Israel under every condition, I think for the Israeli politicians it's making it much more easier to go with the identity politics or to bolden the Jewishness of the state. That's a little bit because of the attitude that has been adopted by Washington as well. So Washington is not, on the contrary of before, Washington now is not politically correct at all. And to be honest, it doesn't care about that as well. But on the other hand, I think for the rest of the world, if you are talking about the non-Western countries or the non-Western parts of the world, nationalism and patriotism, of course, are very, very close to each other, these two terms, but there's a slight difference as well. For the patriotism, to a certain extent, it has a potential of course, accepting the other differences as well, where nationalism is kind of an ideology that is being based on one race. But for the non-Western part of the world, nationalism, I think, for a while is going to be the valid policy or the ideology, because by the emergence of these new economies, it requires the nationalist, to a certain extent, at least nationalist, patriotic narration, because people feel that if countries want to succeed, they need independent governments. And unfortunately, being independent governments or independent politicians requires a nationalistic, patriotic narration.
But it also impinges on the whole idea of globalization, which is essentially how the world is moving forward. It can't really do without globalization. So, Mr. Nishant, my question really to you, you're taking a look at what happened to the UK, what has happened in terms of Brexit. Is that a perfect example or closer to what nationalism looks like when it's in play?
See, in order to go further, we first of all need to understand what is nationalism, which is actually in the backdrop of patriotism, which started many centuries back. Earlier, we used to have kingdoms. They had patriots. What were the patriots supposed to do? To go attack other kingdoms and take control. That's all what the patriots were supposed to do. They were not supposed to serve the country within, neither do farming or nor do any kind of work within the country, within their kingdom. Now, that's exactly what is now called a nationalism or nationalistic approach, that these people are supposed to now, the rulers currently, there could be a democratic ruler or otherwise. Now, if in case they are trying to look at an angle by virtue of which, if they want to take control of any other region, could it be country or anything, is that the reason why nationalistic behavior is being put forward? It is not supposed to be, doing farming within the country. Per se, India, Bharatiya Janata Party is supposed to be a nationalistic party. I am sure they're not preparing farmers. I'm sure that they're not injecting the nationalistic or the patriot idea within the countrymen here in India for doing farming. No, that is not true. They may not be in a readiness to do an attack on any other country. That is not probably the first and the foremost agenda. But isn't that what the mind comes to for the rulers first? Because that's the backdrop and the history of mankind when it comes to patriotism or nationalistic behavior. Bottom line, it has got nothing to do within the organization or a country.
Right.
Whatever it has an impact outside the region.
It has an impact outside the region, but also within its, doesn't it? Especially if we look at history, we look at USSR, the former USSR. I mean, wasn't nationalism sort of one of the reasons why it kind of imploded and it fell apart? And then we see countries where nationalism is affecting minorities, religious minorities especially. Don't you think that it has its downsides also? Because while it gives a great boost to the parties that are promoting it, it's a quick win for them. Of course, it's playing on the emotions of the people that support your country. So everything is focusing on the interests of the country.
Ayza, that is the reason I highlighted the little bit of history, who was Leo Tolstoy. When you rightly point out what happened to the Soviet Union, prior to what happened to the Gorbachevs and others, we know who Leo Tolstoy was. His letter to United Kingdom was very simple and plain. His book about patriotism versus peace defines everything. I cannot put up that within a few minutes here, but if somebody across the globe picks up in any language the book called Patriotism versus Peace by Leo Tolstoy, it talks, to the teeth of what this measles to mankind as described by Rabindranath Tagore means. It is nothing but an evil.
Okay. So, Mr. Resul, as we move forward, we're seeing European Union parliamentary elections taking place. A great number of votes went to the nationalist parties. It's interesting to see that this trend is not just secluded or pertaining to third world countries. It is all across the board. Even President Trump's policies are based on, and his political campaign before he got elected was high nationalism based, wasn't it?
Well, that's yeah, to a certain extent I will agree with you. But on the other hand, we need to make a little bit difference between the kind of new far-right movements that are on rise in the western part of the world and this patriotism that is belonging to the rest of the world. In the West, as Benedict Anderson, who is the writer of The Imagined Communities, which is an iconic book about the rise of the nationalism, simply the nationalism in the Western experience has been on rise by replacing the religion. Once the religion has lost its credibility and its argumentative superiority, so they needed to bring up a new identity for the states, an identity that's local and within a certain border. So the nationalism in the western part of the world has come up by replacing the religion itself, and naturally, quickly, it has been shifted into the racism and led loss of the clashes. Once you get the religion out, so there was no common ground for any German, between any German or a French or German or another nation. That's why, so this kind of the nationalism has been shifted into the racism and quickly led to world wars. But when it comes to the Eastern experience, I don't think that Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities will reflect the truth. For example, given my own country, Turkey, or most probably your own country, Pakistan, and if you look at the rhetoric of the governments that are using, you will see, well, actually, this is a kind of nationalistic rhetoric. But to a certain extent, that's why I think we need to make a difference between the patriotism and the nationalism. I think the rhetoric that is being used in these kind of countries, the eastern part of the world, is not nationalistic, but patriotic, because as I said, the nations in this part of the world has been longing for too much, looking for the independent governments. And our governments are, for the first time, maybe using such an independent rhetoric that is putting their national interest in first. So this is different.
That is the difference between the two. I'm sorry, I'm going to there, Mr. Resul. We've run out of time, but thank you so much for your valuable input. And once again, thank you, Mr. Nishant Varma, for participating here on Newswire. That's all the time we have for today. Until next time, goodbye.